I can't believe you got me to watch this horrible episode again. But you did, and here I am talking about it. The Boys Season 4, Episode 6, Dirty Business, nearly made me quit the entire series when it first aired. Not because it was shocking. The Boys has always been shocking. Not because it was disgusting. The Boys has always been disgusting. But because this episode felt like the moment the show forgot the difference between exposing depravity and participating in it for laughs. This was the Tech Knight and Web Weaver episode. I shudder even saying those names. The episode where Huey gets thrown into one of the most humiliating, disturbing, gross-out scenarios the show has ever put to screen. And yes, there is a real conversation to be had about what happens to Huey in this episode. A lot of people online focused on that, and I understand why. The consent issue is there. The humiliation is there. The way the show treats his suffering as comedy is there. But for me, the thing that almost broke the show was even broader than that. This episode felt like the moment the Boys stopped being shocking with purpose and started feeling like fetish humiliation content on a prestige TV budget. The farting, the bodily fluids, the cave, the safe words, the web weaver suit, the Tech Knight depravity, the constant escalation, the way the show kept daring the audience to tap out like it was proud of how much ugliness it could put on screen. And worst of all, Ashley was right there in the middle of it. That matters because Ashley is not just some disposable background freak. The show keeps asking us to see her as an actual character. It keeps setting up the idea that there may be something tragic, broken, sympathetic, or even redeemable underneath all of the corporate cowardice. Going into the series finale, she is literally the President of the United States. She is not just some random Vought employee anymore. The show clearly wants us to process her as a major figure. But after this episode, I don't know how the show expected me to ever look at Ashley the same way. And that is the real issue. This is not just about an episode being gross. The Boys has always been gross. This is about an episode where the grossness started damaging the show's characters, the story, and my ability to trust the writers. Because after Herogasm, it felt like the show started confusing escalation with storytelling. It could not just be edgy anymore. It had to be grosser, more humiliating, more degrading, more, can you believe we went there? And eventually, that started happening to characters we were supposed to really care about. That is where this episode almost lost me, because edginess alone was never what made The Boys great. The first season was not great because it was gross. It was great because the grossness had a point. The shock had a target. The depravity revealed something about power, celebrity, corporations, politics, sex, violence, media, and the way people get chewed up by systems bigger than themselves. But by the time of Dirty Business, it felt like the shock had become the point. So now, because apparently the algorithm has decided I am the guy who suffers through The Boys for content, I subjected myself to this episode again. On a Sunday, no less. God help me. And here's the part I completely forgot until I came back to this episode. A-Train's redemption basically happens in this episode. That is insane to me. The one character people still mostly agree was written well across the entire show, the guy who literally kills Huey's girlfriend in episode 1 and sets the entire series in motion, has one of his most important moral turning points in this same episode. A-Train saves Mother's Milk's life, and when that child looks at him like he is genuinely heroic for the first time, he starts crossing the line from selfish survival into actual courage. That should be one of the most important moments in this entire series. That should be one of the things that I remember the most from Season 4. But it is buried inside the same episode where Huey is being dragged through the tech cave nightmare with Tech Knight, Web Weaver, Ashley, bodily fluids, humiliation, and whatever else this cursed billionaire Batman parody decided we needed to experience. That is the problem. The episode actually contains important character development. There is real story here. There is real movement for A-Train. There is even some actual character development for the Deep. Kevin, my least favorite member of the Seven, gets actual character development in this episode. I couldn't believe it when I rewatched it. But weirdly enough, when he talks about how killing people makes him feel powerful because it feels like he is finally silencing everyone who laughs at him, I actually started to understand him. That is horrible development, obviously. He is just a terrible person. He's the worst person. But it does tell us something real about him. It shows the insecurity underneath his abuses of power. So the episode is not empty. That almost makes it worse. Because the gross out material is so overpowering that it poisons the memory of the entire thing. Season 4, in my mind, is the least memorable season of The Boys, but somehow it's the most mentally scarring. When I think back on Season 4, I barely remember the actual plot. I remember Sage. I remember A-Train's redemption. I remember Firecracker being disrespected by basically everyone around her. But mostly, I remember this episode. I remember the tech cave. I remember the gross out humiliation. I remember sitting there thinking, what the hell happened to the boys? And the wild thing is, coming back to the episode, I realized my memory had actually made it even worse than it really was. In my head, this episode had mutated into something even more cursed. I remember details being more extreme than they actually were. I remember the humiliation is even more graphic, even more bodily fluid obsessed, even more nightmarish than what was literally on the screen. And that is honestly fascinating in the worst way. Because that tells me the episode did not just gross me out. It infected the way I remembered this season. This is how overpowering the tone of this episode was. That is how much it hijacked my brain. Even when the literal episode was slightly less insane than the nightmare version my brain stored away, it was still disgusting enough that my mind filed it under, never watch this again. And yet here I am, watching it again, for views. This is what the algorithm does to a man. But let's talk about Tech Night for a second, because on paper, the concept should work. The Tech Cave is obviously a parody of the Batcave. That idea makes sense on paper. In a normal superhero story, the Batcave is the sacred trauma temple. It is where a billionaire turns childhood pain into discipline, justice, technology, and myth. So the boy's asking, what if that billionaire cave was actually a private torture dungeon for a depraved rich freak? Is not a bad satirical premise. That is exactly the kind of evil superhero inversion this show was built to do. The idea is not the problem. The execution is the problem. Because instead of the tech cave feeling like sharp Batman satire, it turns into this extended fetish humiliation nightmare that completely overwhelms any good points it had. Tech Knight himself is not just evil, he is vile in this smug, aristocratic, generationally rotten way. There is that scene where he talks to A-Train about how his family wealth came from catching escaped slaves and then evolved into profiting from prisons. Then he looks right at A-Train and basically tells him his ancestors would have put him back where he belonged. That scene is uncomfortable before the episode even gets to its worst material. And look, I understand what the show is doing. Tech Knight represents old money evil, generational cruelty, racism laundered through institutions, billionaire sadism with a superhero logo slapped on top. I get the point, but the scene is still so grotesquely unsubtle that it almost feels like the show wants to create a race war right in that room. It's not clever, it's not funny, it is just another disgusting person saying disgusting things while the episode keeps stacking ugliness on top of ugliness. And yes, it helps push A-Train toward defecting. But even Homelander hates Tech Knight. So I'm not sure this episode needed to make Tech Knight this cartoonishly vile in every possible direction to get A-Train where he needed to go. At a certain point, he stops feeling like a character and starts feeling like a landfill of every evil the writers could think to dump into one character. Then you have the political satire in this episode. And this is another place where the writing feels fake to me. The future president figure says abortion should be banned because the woman's body naturally rejects non-consensual conceptions. I know that is supposed to be some kind of joke. I know they are trying to parody insane pro-life rhetoric, but I have never heard anyone who is actually against abortion say that non-consensual conceptions are rejected by the woman's body. That is not how pro-life Christians actually talk. They usually quote scripture. They talk about God knowing you before you were formed. They talk about being knit together in the womb. They argue that life has purpose regardless of the circumstances of the conception. You can disagree with that. You can hate that. You can critique that. But at least critique the thing people actually believe. Do not invent this bizarre biological lie detector womb defense system straw man argument and act like you just exposed some hypocrisy. It is not sharp satire if the straw man is made of Play-Doh. And yes, then they make the obvious Mike Pence style reference with the Christian politician who refuses to be alone with women, except for the ones that are his mistress. Again, I get what they're aiming at. Christian political hypocrisy is a real thing. Religious image management is a real thing. Public morality paired with private corruption is absolutely fair game for satire. I'm all for it. But this episode does not feel like it is satirizing Christianity from a place of understanding. It feels like it is inventing the dumbest possible version of people the writers hate, and then congratulating itself for being brave, for exposing things that they have no proof for. If this is how people on the left genuinely see people on the right, then no wonder the country feels like it is constantly one bad comment section away from civil war. I would honestly respect the show more if the satire felt authentic. You can roast Christianity, you can roast conservatives, you can roast politicians, you can roast the hypocrisy, please do. There's plenty to roast. I roast it too. I roast my side, I roast their side. Anyone who is hypocritical, anyone who doesn't put their actions where their words are, I will call them out. That's the difference. People who actually think for themselves and can call out BS on any side, I respect. But at least make it sound like you have met the people you are mocking. At least make it sound like you're actually criticizing things that they really said. Because in this episode, so much of it feels fake. Not offensive because it is too true, offensive because it is too lazy. And that laziness matters because the boys used to feel smarter than that. The boys used to call out legitimate issues in a clever way. But now they're just creating these caricatures of evil for things that they disagree with. Firecracker in this episode also hits differently looking back. Everyone disrespects her. Homelander disrespects her. The Room disrespects her. She is treated like a joke. And knowing where she ends up, it is honestly sad. I do not think the show itself fully made me feel bad for her at the time. If anything, it often treats her like a punchline. But after doing deeper analysis of her character, after thinking about her humiliation, her faith language, her need to belong, her devotion to Homelander, and the way she is willing to destroy herself for a false god who barely respects her, I cannot help seeing something tragic there. The episode does not really give her that depth, but the pieces are there. And that's frustrating too for a completely different reason. Because sometimes the show has fascinating material buried under layers of contempt. There are real genius ideas behind every season. That's the reason people keep asking, why do you keep watching if you hate it so much? It's because I see glimmers of what I loved in season 1, but the show can't help but just trudge through the dirt and the decay and the debauchery, time after time after time, burying its own leads under garbage, under filth, under crap. It's like every time you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then they just pile and pile the crap on top of you until the light disappears. A-Train's redemption, the Deep's insecurity, Firecracker's humiliation, Ashley's repression, Tech Knight as a corrupt billionaire Batman, political power wearing religious language. The bones of an interesting episode are buried in here somewhere. But then the show keeps dragging everything back into the tech cave, back into the grossness, back into the humiliation, back into the feeling that I am not watching satire anymore. I am watching the writers see how much degradation they can make me sit through before I turn it off. And then we get Ashley. The Cameron Coleman stuff with Ashley was already gross, but it made a certain amount of sense for her character. Ashley is extremely repressed. She is constantly dominated by Homelander. She has no real power despite being surrounded by power. So her private life being warped by control, domination, and humiliation tracks with who she is. It is ugly, but it connects back to the character. This episode pushes it to an entirely different level. The domination part, we knew. The repression, we knew. The powerlessness, we knew. But this is sick. This is not just Ashley has messed up coping mechanisms because Vought destroyed her soul. This is the show putting her directly into one of its most repulsive sequences, then later expecting me to process her as someone with serious political and narrative weight. I cannot separate those things. This is what I mean when I say the episode damages characters. It is not that characters cannot be depraved. It is not that characters cannot have dark sexual lives. It is not that Ashley has to be respectable or pure or sanitized. It is that when you push a character into material this humiliating and disgusting, it changes how the audience sees her forever. And if you later want that same character to carry real dramatic weight, you have made your own job harder. That is not prudishness. That is storytelling. You cannot cover a character in radioactive sludge and then act confused when the audience remembers the sludge. And Huey is part of that too. This is not a side of Huey I ever needed to see. The fact that he is pulled into this under false pretenses and without real consent makes the whole thing more disturbing. And then the show just keeps moving. This is part of why it feels so nasty. It does not sit with the horror enough. It does not give the humiliation the weight it would have if this happened to a different character in a different context. It just becomes another insane boys sequence, another thing to make the audience go, wow, they really went there. But eventually, they really went there stops being impressive. Eventually, it becomes exhausting. Eventually, it just becomes boring. Eventually, it just becomes spiritually nauseating. And Dirty Business was that point for me. This is the episode where I felt like The Boys was not just showing me a depraved world anymore. It was making me live in the depravity for too long. And I get that some people will say, that is the point. You are supposed to be disgusted. Sure, but disgust is not automatically meaning. Revulsion is not automatically satire. Humiliation is not automatically commentary. You still have to shape it into something. You still have to make it serve the story. And when the most important A-Train moment of the series is trapped inside the same episode people mostly remember for the tech cave gross-out nightmare, something has gone wrong. When Ashley's later importance is harder to take seriously because my brain is still stuck in this episode, something has gone wrong. When I rewatched the episode and realized my memory turned it into an even worse nightmare because the tone was that scarring, something has gone wrong. That is why the episode nearly made me quit The Boys. Not because I cannot handle dark material. I love dark material. I make dark material. I write dark material. I am not asking The Boys to become clean. I am not asking it to become safe. I am not asking it to stop being shocking. I am asking it to remember why the shock mattered. Because season 1 was not great because it was the grossest thing on television. Season 1 was great because underneath all the blood, sex, corporate evil, and superhero depravity, it still had a human center. Huey grieving Robin, Butcher's rage, Starlight's disillusionment, Homelander's terrifying need for worship, A-Train's cowardice and guilt. There were people under the shock. By season 4, episode 6, it felt like the shock was swallowing the people. And that is when I almost checked out. I honestly do not know how I kept watching after this. Maybe because I had already invested too much. Maybe because A-Train's arc was still working. Maybe because Homelander was still compelling. Maybe because part of me still remembered how much I loved season 1 and hoped the show could recapture that magic. Or maybe I just had to see how it all ended. That is what fandom does to you. A show earns your loyalty when it is great, then years later you are still sitting there getting psychologically assaulted by the tech cave because the first season was just that good. That is tragic. That is loyalty abuse. That is how they get you. And now I have watched this episode twice. Once as a viewer, once as a content creator sacrificing my peace to the algorithm. My head hurts. My spirit hurts. My memory of season 4 is somehow even worse than season 4 itself. And yes, I know there are important scenes in this episode. Yes, A-Train gets one of his most important moments. Yes, there are ideas here that could have worked. Yes, the Tech Cave as a Batman parody is a good concept. Keyword concept. But the execution went too far. The Boys has always been disgusting. The Boys has always been diabolical. But this was the episode where the disgust stopped feeling like a weapon aimed at the story's targets and started feeling like a weapon aimed at the audience itself. A-Train saves Mother's Milk's life. A-Train saves Mother Milk's... A-Train saves Mother's Milk... A-Train saves Mother's Milk's life. And when that child looks at him like